there's the green light. Okay, yeah. Yeah, all the years I've been in church, I found out that the last Sunday in December, it's kind of like the great exchange of churches because people are traveling, and people that we normally see aren't here; they're in some other church, and the people we don't see too often, they come and they're visiting family in town. They come to our church, and so yeah, it's always kind of a mixed bag of surprises when we come to the last Sunday in December. All right, so we're concluding this year the theme prepare, and I think you're moving into a new theme next week. And perseverance, is that? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm not that old. I remember these things. Okay, so yeah, this is the last message for 2025. And yeah, also, we don't do this too much anymore, but in the old days, people used to write checks, and they would always, into January, they'd write 2025, and we'd have to have them rewrite the check, so those things happen. But yeah, we're going to finish up here with preparing to share the gospel, all right? And this is from the life of the Apostle Paul, and from what he wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9:16 to 23. All right, so I want us to begin by, thinking about the people who am I doing this right? Oh, I can go down. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of people who do different things, and they do them well. And the first person I thought about when I thought about this description was Shohei. And I am not a D fan. I can't even say that word. But yeah, Shohei, he's a unique player. I mean, he can hit with the best of them, but he can also pitch. And you just don't find that happening. I mean, Babe Ruth 100 years ago did it, but then they just turned him into a hitter. But Shohei, I mean, he can do everything. I kind of wonder when he gets older if he's going to be able to manage or to coach. I found out a lot of the great players, they do things so well, and they try to teach someone else how to do it. It just doesn't go over very well. But anyway, Shohei is one of those guys who does things, different things, and he does them well. The other person I thought about is one of my favorite actors is Denzel. And like if you watch a Sylvester Stallone movie, you kind of know what's coming up. There's going to be a lot of explosions. There's going to be a lot of fighting. A lot of violence. I mean, that's what Stallone does. But Denzel, uh, think of all the roles he's played. He's played a government agent. He's played a football coach. He's played a black soldier in the Union Army. And then way back in the early 80s, maybe one of his first films, he played a college student. And people look at that, and my kids say, that's Denzel? I go, yeah, he's probably about 25 years old at that time. But he plays a variety of roles, and he plays them all well, and he can do comedy, he can do drama. I don't think I've ever heard him sing, but he does a lot of different roles, and he does them well. And I think about that as we come to this topic of preparing to share the gospel, because I think a lot of times when we think about sharing our faith, uh, we get into a singular mode. And a lot of our college students with AECF, their only method of sharing the gospel is cold calling. And they like to get out onto the campus. They like to get on a pathway where people are, and they get in front of somebody. Hi, and you got a minute, and that's how they share the gospel. But then when it comes to studying with someone, and somebody's having a hard time with an exam or having a hard time with a class, they don't know how to enter into that and say, hey, let me pray for you. Let's see what God can do. And uh, they're just stuck in that one mode of sharing the gospel. And so, how can we become a little more versatile in the way that we share our faith? And I think Elson kind of took my message away this morning because you guys had dinner with your next door neighbors. That's a different way of sharing the gospel. When someone you encounter is sick and you offer to pray for them. It's a way of sharing the gospel. If you meet somebody at work and they're having a hard time with their boss, it's a way to share the gospel. And so we need to learn how to engage in conversations instead of confrontation. We need to learn how to enter into the variety of life situations that God puts us into. And I think a lot of times we think that we don't have a chance to share our faith, but if we just think in the past week, the people that we've met, the encounters that God gives to us, there are many, many opportunities to engage in conversation with people in sharing the gospel. Uh, I get my hair cut every so often. I go to the same place, and every time I go in, I get a chance to share with the guy cutting my hair. He's stuck there. He can't go away. He's got to cut my hair. And so, we start talking about things, and he tells me about his mom. He tells me about the lady friend that he lives with. He talks about the divorce that he had a few years ago. He talks about his daughter in college. And there's just a lot of different conversations that we can have in sharing about Jesus and how Jesus enters into the lives of people. And so that's what I want us to focus on here today. You know, uh, the uh, the versatility that we need, how versatility leads us to sharing the gospel freely. All right. So why is it that we have so much apprehension in sharing Jesus with others? Because I think a lot of times we just don't consider that we don't have to get up into a pulpit. We don't have to have REV in front of our name. We don't have to be someone who's just giving out messages and trying to lead people to Christ. That it can happen in everyday life. And so Paul, as he's writing to the Corinthians here, he kind of addresses this. He talks about three varieties that he experiences when sharing Christ with others. And let's get into those. The first one, uh, there are different perks, and this one's kind of a little bit difficult to describe, but let's take a shot at it here. From verses 16 to 18, he says, "Therefore, when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel." Uh, I wanted to interject here that years ago when I used to take students to Mexico, I would have them memorize verses. And on a lot of the trips, this is the passage that I had them memorize. And they hated memorizing verses because it's not something that they normally do. But I told them, we're going to say the verses every night before dinner, and if you can't say them, you're not going to eat. And so, yeah, they were compelled not just to share the gospel, they were compelled to eat. And so, yeah, they would memorize the verses. So, in this passage, Paul is defending himself against past accusations that he had received from some of the Corinthian believers. If you've ever studied Corinthians, you know that the Corinthian church was kind of shaky. They had some really different kind of characters in there. And apparently, some of them objected to Paul as he was doing ministry. Uh, some of them thought he was out just to do it for money. I don't know why anybody thinks that people would preach for money, because there's plenty of other ways to earn income besides preaching. But it was an accusation that was coming out against him. And so he's defending himself in this passage. And so, yeah, what is his motivation for preaching the gospel? He says here that he claims no credit for preaching the gospel. It's not something that comes from him. It's not something that he is trying to advance himself. It is something that he is compelled to do because of his relationship with Jesus, because of the call that the Holy Spirit has put upon his life. He is compelled to preach, and he even uses this phrase, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." And you kind of wonder, what is that all about? Is there some kind of punishment that God is going to give to him if he does not preach. But I don't think that's what it is. I think what he is saying is, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, because that is the call that God had placed upon his life. And if you don't engage in the calling that you have, in some ways you suffer for that, because there's something missing in your life. I've known people who had a gift for leading worship, and if they don't do that, there's some anxiety. There's something that comes upon them, because it's not because they're not getting the accolades, but it's because they're not fulfilling the calling that God has placed upon them. And so I believe that's what Paul is saying here, that woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, because that is what he has been called to do. And so he presents two different scenarios. He says if he preaches voluntarily, he has a reward, because he is fulfilling, what God has asked him to do. But he says if not voluntarily, he is still discharging the trust that is committed to him. And he understands that this is his calling, this is what God has for him to do, and that whether it's voluntarily and people are there to hear him, he has a reward in doing that. But if it is not voluntary, he is still discharging what has been committed to him. And so he concludes this section with this statement: in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. And so, in answer to the critics that were in the Corinthian church, he is saying, he is doing this without any expectation of being compensated. Even though as an apostle, as a missionary, it was within his rights, it was proper for him to receive support from the churches that he ministered to. All right, so as I mentioned, this is a little bit hard to apply, because I don't think any of you are being offered income for preaching the gospel. Did your neighbors offer you money for? They offered you money? Oh, okay. It doesn't happen that way, and I think if we're sharing, like if I'm sharing with my barber, he doesn't give me a free haircut because I'm sharing the gospel with him. So it's a little difficult for us to, find an application for this. But, how does this apply for us in 2025 and 26? All right, if we share the gospel, let me ask you to think of it this way. If we share the gospel because someone asked, if it's a friend of ours, someone we know, we're going to get a reward, because they're either going to thank us for what we've shared, or we may even see them come to know Christ. And we go, yeah, that's great. I was able to lead my friend to Christ. And there's a personal reward in that. Sometimes I tell the story of my friend in San Diego that I used to live in his house with him. And he came to our church in San Diego just out of nowhere. And we didn't know why he came. He just showed up. And he later told us that the reason he came was because he was single. And his mom said to him, when are you going to get married? And she said, why don't you go to a church? There's nice Chinese girls in the church. Maybe you can meet one. That's why he came to church. But, he came to our fellowship. I shared with him. Another person shared with him. And he eventually came to receive Christ. And he's still down at our church in San Diego. He's one of the supporters of my ministry. And, I'm always glad to see him. And I have a reward from sharing the gospel with him. All right, but what if you are sharing with someone without an invitation? You're just sharing with a stranger. You're just sharing with someone that you may never see again. What's the reward in that? You don't know if the person will come to faith or not. But see, you are still following what God has called you to do. You're still discharging the trust that has been given to you. Now, one thing I need to say is, little is gained when we try to make it a big deal about us preaching the gospel, because we may get criticized. We may get people who speak out against us, just like what happened in the Corinthian church here. But see, there is little gain for us to make it about ourselves. There's little to gain to say, well, I have rights here to preach. I'm just exercising freedom of religion. I'm just doing, what I'm called to do. And, we become kind of a pain to people. Little is gained from that. But if we share freely with people and we engage in these gospel conversations with people, then there is a reward, one way or the other. We had an AECF student a few years ago. We used to send some students to China, and she was talking to one of the Chinese students in the university over there, and she asked him, can I tell you my story? And he goes, no, 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 no. And he said, yeah, I'm here at the university. I'm here to get an education. I want to get a good job. Yeah, I don't want to talk about that kind of stuff. She said, yeah, okay. And then the next day, the group was out on a tour, and so they're on a bus. And so she's talking to another student, and this time the girl that she's talking to says, yeah, tell me your story. And so she starts telling her story about how she came to know Christ. Now, even though we are Asian American Christian Fellowship, this girl happened to be not quite Asian. She was, that's hard to say. Never mind. Okay. She's half Filipino and half Caucasian. Okay. And so she said that all her life she was not a believer. And she said that how she came to know Christ was through our campus ministry, Asian American Christian Fellowship. And she was telling this girl about how she became a Christian in AECF. And just so happens, the guy that said he didn't want to listen to her was sitting right behind her. So he had to listen to her story anyway. And she didn't give much thought to it, but then about 6 months after the trip concluded, she got a letter from the guy that didn't want to hear her story. And he told her that some things had happened in his life. He said the first thing was he heard her story and it just blew him away, because he said that he had always been taught that if you go to America, that Christianity is all about the Caucasian people, and that Asians do not participate in Christianity. And when she said that she became a Christian not through the general American public, but through an Asian group, he goes, what? That can't happen. But she said, yeah, it was through a group of Asians. Then the next thing that happened to him, that following semester, he met a professor that he was studying under, and he found out that this professor was a Christian. And that blew him away, because he said he had been taught that if you want to pursue academics, if you want to rise, and if you want to achieve something, you can't have anything to do with Christianity or any kind of religion. And to meet this professor and he found out that he was a believer, he goes, wait, this can't happen. But God began to work in him, and make a long story short, he came to know Christ, and he accepted Christ into his life. And so he wrote, to our student, she was at Cal at the time, and shared this with her. And see, she was like Paul. She just shared the trust that had been committed to her. And when she left China, she didn't have a reward. Now, it came later, and so she did have a reward. But it didn't matter whether she knew the result or she didn't get the result. She was still discharging the trust that was committed to her. And so that's what I encourage us to do. Don't worry about whether you're going to see the person come to know Christ, whether this is going to be something that you can rejoice in. Just be glad that you're sharing the trust that has been committed to you. All right? Okay, the second one here. different identities in verses 19 through 21. All right. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. Sometimes Paul, in his writings, he he writes a lot of words. You have to kind of what did he say there? Okay, so let's try to explain this here. So Paul is addressing the question about his ministry to both Jews and Gentiles, and he says, "Though I am free and belong to no one," he is saying that he is now free of the Jewish laws, of the rituals that he once followed as a Pharisee. He said, I'm free of those things. But he says, I have made myself a slave to everyone. He's speaking particularly about the Gentiles, because if you look back in the book of Acts, that it was a major turning point for the church to reach out to the Gentiles, to non-Jewish people. And for Paul to do this, he got some criticism, and it was somewhat difficult for him. But he says here, I've made myself a slave to everyone. In other words, he is making himself available to whoever he meets, whether it's a Jewish person or whether it's a Gentile. He makes himself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. And so those parenthetical statements there, he says, the first one, though I myself am not under the law. He's saying, I am no longer following the Jewish laws, but he says, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, he still will participate in some of the Jewish ceremonies because he wants to reach the Jewish people. He doesn't do it because he feels like he has to do this in order to make God happy. He does it because he knows that this will give him an opening to talk with those of Jewish background. And so in his ministry, Paul had encountered both Jews and Gentiles. And he lived his life in such a way, he calls himself a slave to everyone because he wanted to get into the lives of people and be able to share Jesus with them. And so, how do we follow this? How do we approach people who have different religious identities? And the question I want to ask is, first of all, are we leading them into a relationship with Christ, or are we just leading them into a new religion? I don't know if any of you have ever talked to someone who is of Muslim background, of Hindu background, of Buddhist background, and a lot of times we put ourselves in a position, without really saying it, what we're trying to communicate to them is, your religion is wrong. And the way you practice faith is leading you to hell. And if you follow my religion, then you'll be on a better path, and God will accept you. Now, I think all of us in here would probably agree to that. We would agree that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through him. I think we all agree with that. But how do we communicate that with people? Is it so much that we are right and they are wrong? Are we leading them into a relationship with Christ or into a new religion? And I would think that people are more open to the idea of becoming close to God. And the fact that they may be following the wrong religion, that's something God will deal with as they go along. I don't think we have to convince them that, so much that they're wrong. It's that we want to lead them into a new relationship with Christ. And that's even what happened with the Apostle Paul, because he was following all the Jewish rituals until the day Jesus met him on the road to Damascus. And his life changed at that point because Jesus established a relationship with him. How are we trying to lead people? Uh, is it from something that is wrong to something that is right? Uh, or are we leading them to get away from this idea of appeasing God, making God happy, and then leading them into actually knowing God personally? And in my experiences, if you start talking about your religion versus my religion, it just gets into a debate. And it's probably helpful in some ways. It's not wrong, but it doesn't really lead into a path for someone to come to know Jesus. And I believe if we focus on the idea that you can know God personally, we'll get a lot farther along in the ways that we share our faith. All right. Number 3, different perspectives. And let's read the last 2 verses here, 22 and 23. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. So in this final section, when Paul is talking about the weak, he's not talking about non-believers. He's actually talking about believers in these last 2 verses. And so he calls them weak. And that seems kind of strange to us, because the ones he was talking about were people who would stand for the Jewish faith, who would stand for the law, who would stand for all of the practices that they've had. And I don't think they perceive themselves as weak. But what Paul is saying is that when it comes to faith, when it comes to a relationship with Christ, yeah, they're weak. And we know that a lot of times we can be weak in things without even knowing it. And that's the case that Paul has here with the Judaizers who still want to follow after the Jewish laws and religion. So Paul says, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. So he's saying, I'm not going to argue with them. He wants them to understand that we're on the same side. We're all pursuing the same things. We're all pursuing after God. We want to know God more. We want to live our lives for the glory of God. And we're all in that same boat. And so he says, to the weak I became weak. I've become all things to all people. And he says that he does that so that by all possible means he might save some. And so what Paul is saying is that the gospel message is more important to him than his own personal preferences. A few years ago, I got invited to a conference out in Kansas. Missouri. I flew into Kansas City, but it was in Missouri. And during the week, they wanted me to be at a camp. They wanted me to be dressed kind of like this, without this. They gave me some grace. They said I'd have to wear this. But they wanted me in a shirt and look somewhat dignified. Then there was one day in the week where the students they were not going to be in sessions. They were going to go out into the area to do ministry in different places. And so I was going to be at the campground. I was staying behind. I was just going to stay there. And so I came to breakfast wearing my San Diego gear and my shorts and my running shoes. And a lady came up behind me and she goes, Pastor Kwan, we do not wear shorts at the camp. You're the speaker. I go, but I thought they were going out today. She goes, no, you still have to. And I go, okay, all right. I wasn't going to argue with her. And when the kids came back, I put on my priestly garb again. And, I was willing to do whatever was needed, whatever was called upon to share with the students. And, it didn't matter to me. It was hard for me. I kind of laughed and I go, oh, okay. But, I was willing to go along with what they wanted. And I wanted to be able to share with them because I felt like if I had taken a stand, no, I'm going to wear my shorts, I'm going to wear my Padres shirt, uh, that would not have gone well. And so, yeah, we become all possible things so that we might save some. We do whatever is necessary to share the gospel. So I believe what Paul is telling us in this passage is this, that sharing the gospel is not about us. It's not about how we think things are supposed to be right, about what we're comfortable in doing. By all possible means, we want to save some. And so this question, how are we making the gospel accessible to those around us? Are we clearly revealing God to them? Are we using language that they can comprehend? Uh, have any of you ever written your personal testimony and then you go over it and you realize all the Christianese words that you use? You know, you'll say things like, well, when I was in my fellowship group, and do you, do you know people on the street, uh, how many times do they use the word fellowship? I mean, to us, it's pretty normal. I mean, we talk about fellowship groups all the time. But, go walk on Main Street in Alhambra and ask them, what's a fellowship? They'll think it's Lord of the Rings, okay? Uh, they don't, then we get into the theological terms. Oh, I was washed in the blood of the Lamb. You were what? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, are we using language that others can comprehend? And are we connecting the gospel message to our friend's life? Or are we just giving them a standard pitch that we've learned, that we're comfortable with, that we understand, but do they get it? And so, yeah, are we connecting the gospel message to our friends' lives? And finally, preparing to share the gospel has more to do with God, more to do with the other person than with what we might be comfortable doing. And so I believe that Paul's message here, the attitude that he is communicating to us, are in these words, that sharing the gospel is more about glorifying God. It's more about speaking to the other person than it is for us to be comfortable. It is more than trying to get them to become like us. We want them to come to know God personally, and then God will begin to refine them. God will begin to take care of them. It may be surprising what God will do in a person's life, but see, that's not up to us to manage or to dictate. We allow God to speak into their lives. So, Lord, we bring this before you here as we conclude this year about prepare. And I pray, Father, that you would prepare us for opportunities that we have when we meet people, and that what we communicate is more about you, more about them, less about us. And so I pray, Father, that that would give us a freedom to share with people, and that we don't have to worry about conforming to ideas, conforming to standards. We simply discharge the trust that is committed to us. And so we pray this now in Jesus' name. Amen.